Hey everybody, this is Mitchell Amador, the CEO of Immunefi, and welcome back to the Immunefi Show. Today we have a very special guest, an old friend of, I think, of a lot of the people who will be listening in, namely Adam. Well, I mean, sorry, Sock.
Yeah, you can call me Adam. You can call me Sock. I don't. There's no mystery. So.
Well, breach, offset, breach. Hold on. Whoops. Sock, Adam, whatever we're going to decide in the new world. Let's go with Sock, so that people can find you on social media. And that's what life is about these days, social media. Okay, and as many of you will know, he used to run the competitive audits platform Code Arena, which arguably invented the competitive audit format and created a lot of interesting innovations in the space, as well as helping birth the careers of thousands of our security colleagues, especially as auditors in the industry. So he's made quite an impact. What people don't know as well is that Sock here has been involved, aka Adam, has been involved in security for a long time, some decades now. I think that's fair to say, decades?
Yeah.
Some decades.
I got enough gray in my beard. Well, yeah, it's a gray beard now. So
before you showed your sparkling face here, I had no idea. Could have been, no salt and pepper as far as I knew. But he's worked in security a long time. I guess it's not a surprise given his know-how around C4. And he'll talk a little bit about that momentarily, but he's actually been working on something really exciting. Much like a saint locking themselves up in a cave on the mountain, Sock here has thrown himself, into the cavern that is LLM security, the unsolvable problems, and asked, how do I identify, how do I solve the original sin of LLMs? How do we create an AI-first world that's really going to be safe? And he has returned after 14 months on the mountain. He has come down with some tablets, and he's going to be reading them to us today. I'm very excited to find out. No pressure, but there are expectations in this call. So without further ado, Sock, why don't you tell us about yourself? Who are you?
Well, so yeah, most people know me as Sock. Adam, I have a very long and varied career in a lot of different domains, technology-wise. But prior to Code Arena, I was, so I founded a company called And Yet, almost 20 years ago. And we were very early to a bunch of stuff. We just sort of had a lot of really cool, interesting talent that were all very ambitious and wanted to do a lot of different things. And where I was born, it's sort of a weird location in Washington State where there's a national lab here, and then there's also this is where the Manhattan Project had its one of the major sites. So there's a ton of research in our area, but it's not really like a tech hub by any stretch. But there's a ton of people that were software adjacent, and so I started this business and then started just growing talent collection group and ended up getting into security on the chance of meeting a guy who goes by Evil Packet, whose name's Adam Baldwin, and he frankly changed my life in many ways. Probably one of my closest and dearest friends. But I met him. I never thought about security at all. Not a bit. I was a web developer, had done a lot of stuff that just were projects that I wanted to make on the web. And then I started this company, was doing web development, design, that kind of stuff. And then one day, so he's a friend of a friend, and I get this email out of the blue that says, your CAPTCHA is insecure. Which is the funniest thing, by the way. This is like my stupid little website, like for my, tiny development agency. And it's like, who cares about CAPTCHA? Someone could have bypassed my CAPTCHA. So, yeah. So anyway, I get this message from him, and he's like, oh, by the way, your CAPTCHA is insecure. And that's how I met him. And I went out to lunch with him the next week. I was like, hey, nice to meet you. And then we became very good friends. And almost everything I learned about security, I learned from him. And he then joined our team later on. And I was always like trying to think of like, how do we help grow the security side of what we're doing? And he and I kind of teamed up a little bit before he even joined. And when he was looking for ways to get to get business and building up really his pen testing business, I was like, well, hey, what if he's always finding these exploits and sending them to me and then would demonstrate them. And then I was like, what if you just owned my accounts on video instead of your disclosures that you would provide to businesses? What if you just own my account, video that, send the disclosure, wait for the thing to be fixed, and then publish the video? And so we made this site called Evil Packet, that we called education through exploitation, where he would just own my accounts and then we publish that. And as a result of that, we got a lot of visibility and ended up getting like a contact form off of that effort that landed us GitHub as GitHub's first security consultant. So Chris Wanstrath, original CEO of GitHub, fills out this contact form and says, hey, yeah, we totally need, we need somebody to look at our stuff and, get in on advising us from a security perspective. Mm-hmm. And so we built that business up, and then we were very early in the Node ecosystem as well, as we started looking at like the dynamic was always like we had the people doing development, people doing design, and we had people that were like, people doing development, people doing security, right? So people who are over on the builder side, like trying to build whatever, and then people over here that are just like, hey, I'm going to poke at your thing and tell you all the stuff that's broken with it. And so we were always thinking like, as we were adopting newer stuff, the security guys were always just going like, hey, let me poke at that. Hey, let me poke at that. And we had some people that were like starting to play with Node when Node was really new. And so they started looking at like different ways of attacking, and supply chain attacks were the thing that really stood out from an NPM perspective, which of course, like now this is the thing we all know very well about supply chain attacks, but nobody knew anything really about supply chain attacks at that time. And so then Adam, Evil Packet, like he was like, hey, this is a big thing. This is actually like really serious from a risk perspective. We need to think about this. So we ended up kind of doing a lot of this research for our customers, on security basis, where we would be auditing not just their code, but their modules as well. So just saying like, you need to take a look at this. You need to pin your versions. This is like back in the days when no one pinned any versions in NPM. It was just like, you just have the name of the package. That's it. And so, he's like, no, you need to do this. You need to establish these practices. And then that became the Node security project. So the Node security project then was this decentralized audit, this really ambitious project to do a decentralized audit of all the packages in the Node ecosystem. And we said, this is basically like the first kind of like open source security collaborative thing. We were like, hey, we love open source. Like, what if we did this as a like kind of an open source security thing? And this is like 2010, 2011, something like that. And so we had a bunch of people that were contributing to this and finding vulnerabilities and reporting them. And we had this very large, all the clientele that we worked with, we were adding, all these advisories into this. And then eventually we started building tooling. That tooling now exists. We later sold that tooling. That tooling became what is now NPM Audit. So if you use and are annoyed by the stuff you get from NPM Audit, you can blame us for that. But we sold that entire business to NPM Inc., who we'd already had a good long-term relationship with. So, I sort of ended up in that process, learning a lot of things that then really informed how I thought about like doing security from a community perspective. Mm-hmm. What the dynamic of open source and security could be, what the relationship between attackers and defenders could be. And I'm much more defender by default. Like I really love security, but the angle that I'm always looking at it from is like, how do we make things secure that people really can use? So, all of that then kind of traces its way through Code Arena. People have decent familiarity with Code Arena, I would imagine, Immunefi world, and all of the smart contract challenges that that exist there. That entire model, all of it, really first comes from Scott and Zach's great idea of of this mechanism for for how to award things in a competitive audit, but all of the infrastructure of how I thought about like putting the organization together and all of that, and how we really emphasize like making sure that everything gets published and documented, so that now this is all like the training data for all of the things that are taking everybody's security work. But all of that came from the Node Security Project and NSP, which later became NPM Audit and all that. But yeah, so it's sort of through line, and then sort of now have gotten obsessed over the last year and a half with prompt injection.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So that brings you up to this very moment, and you've done something kind of crazy. I read your post. We're gonna add the post to the notes after this show. So for those of you who haven't seen Stock's new article, you'll see it soon. The TLDR is you created a new language, which sounds very painful. You acknowledge that it's a very foolish thing to do, and yet you do it anyways. So there's something going on here. And you also gave it a very interesting name, and I'm not sure, you'll have to correct. Let's start here. Is it supposed to be mild or mild?
Meld. It's Meld. So it actually was MELD originally, but I am a good open source citizen, and there is a project named Meld, and I realized that, hey, if you do mlld, you have LLM backwards in there. So I was like, whatever, that works. It's fine.
My favorite interpretation so far was Meld. I was like, Sock was really, he has farming roots and he wants to go back. He thinks the future is true artisan, farming, agricultural technique, agro AI future. But no, it's Meld. Okay, that makes sense.
But I will tell you that I have really good history of having names that people cannot pronounce in businesses. Because my first business was and yet it's an ampersand YET, and people really had no idea how to pronounce that.
I don't know what the ampersand is for the most part. I think that's
and and then Code Arena, of course, you've got the you've got the 4, and everyone's Code 4 Arena. So I'm like, so when I was like, hey, this is a name, and also it's unpronounceable.
Very on brand. Well, you got this far. You don't have to stop now. But tell us a little bit about. Well, first, let's start at the beginning. I know that. Why would you do this? And feel free to pick up where you left off on prompt injection. Why did you spend more than a year of your life? You could have done anything. You've already explored the depths of the internet. You chose this problem. Why? How did we get here?
Well, probably so when October 24, when the what was it? So when Sonnet 3.5, that kind of nicknamed 3.6 came out, I had played with Sonnet 3.5 before and found it pretty impressive. But then I started having like a lot more detailed both conversations and projects that I was working on with Sonnet 3.6. And I was just kind of blown away. And it was the first moment that I was like, I really think that I could build just about anything with this if I focused on, and this really then like a lot of the Ralph loop stuff, like the core concept, if people are familiar with the Ralph loop that Jeffrey Huntley has really promoted over the last year. Ralph Wiggum is sort of the full name of it, but it's sort of become Ralph loop because of copyright reasons. So the whole idea is like, you basically have an LLM bang its head against the wall, and it's every time it's banging its head against the wall, it's fresh context. So it's just making progress by banging its head against the wall over and over and over. And that was kind of the same insight that I had, not necessarily like, oh, I could put this in a loop and bang and bang and bang and bang and bang automatically, but really like, hey, if you actually work with fresh context in LLM, if you have the right assembly of prior context, and then you have a great starting prompt, and you take that output, and rather than continuing to build that context and just, see it rot. Like if you just go back fresh again and make a little more progress and a little more progress, like you can do some amazing things. And I started to see that. And part of that was just like understanding the technology and how it works. And that essentially like you really are going to get the highest and best performance at the earliest point in the conversation. And this has definitely been proven out through research papers, and people talk about context. But that just changed the way I thought about these things entirely, because I started thinking about all the things that I would do if I could actually use these in a reliable way, right? Not just like, oh, maybe it's like a really, this is a terrible like apocalypse. The apocalypse Google is how I think about LLMs sometimes. It's like, if you had a local LLM and the apocalypse happened, but you still have a device that you could somehow like power whatever, like you have a really shitty Google that's like maybe 80% right, like that still just this right in the pocket, in a small model that you can carry around with it. It's not going to be as good as Google. It's going to have a ton of hallucination, but there's a lot of useful, valuable stuff that it would have. And so I was like, that's kind of how I bucketed that technology. But then started thinking about like, oh, you could do some really cool stuff with it, and that made me want to do cool stuff with it. And then the first problem that happens then is like, well, how do you secure this? Because everything I wanted to do, I mean, hilariously, at that particular moment, the thing I was trying to do was, I'm sure that this quite well. Some of the folks in I'm sure the audience will definitely know this. If you're doing sales in the world of security in the blockchain world, you're on Telegram, and you're just in so many freaking Telegram groups, and so many Telegram DMs, and so many things that you're trying to keep track of. It's just exhausting. And that's the best thing in my life of not being at Coderina anymore, is not living in Telegram. I just absolutely hated it. And it's worse when you're talking about the 24/7 element of crypto, right? Like there isn't like it isn't like, oh, this is the time zone that I live in, and so I go to work and I go home and it's nice, and I'm talking to you, it's evening for you. We're doing this at this time that's convenient for me, and maybe it works in your schedule at this point, but like you're working in the evening, and it's because that is the nature of what this of what this field is. And it's the same in Telegram. You're just constantly in there. So I was like, I'm going to build something, because I can see how this would be great to build something in this context. I'm going to build something to help me like just manage some of this stuff. And then as soon as I started building it, and I built some stuff that was pretty useful, and it wasn't like, I wasn't just going like, oh, I'm going to make a bot for myself and have it represent me. All I wanted to do was just pull data from it and tell me what the status of different chats were and which ones I needed to get back to as quickly as possible, right? So that I'd have some context. And I was pulling that in with like CRM stuff, and and then trying to do some analysis, and and I felt pretty excited about what I was able to create. And then very quickly I was just like, I don't trust this. Like, I don't trust doing this anything other than like me having a quick experiment with this. Like because I knew about prompt injection, and I knew what the combination of risks there were in this particular circumstance. And I'm just like, I'm running a security business. I absolutely can't like, this is not something I can just fuck around and find out. Like, right. Irresponsible of me, but irresponsible of customers. It's not the right thing to do. And so I just was like, well, here's this cool thing that I have that would actually legitimately improve my life. Like 100%, whether I would, be willing or able to, continue doing it, different question. But, as far as what my actual livelihood, what my life looked like, of dealing with that bullshit, that it would have actually made a big difference. And so, it was a frustrating point where it was like, oh, I can see I could do this, and I have no idea how I could secure it in a way that I feel confident about, right? Like I'm looking at it naively. I'm like, well, theoretically, if I did this and I did that, like I could probably feel safe about this. But I'm like, I don't know enough to know what I don't know. So that really kicked off the obsession for me.
I see. So you were still securing crypto when you realized that you just could never be free of Telegram and internet chats. And you're like, it has to end. I need to be free.
Yeah, basically.
That's a good reason. I think that's very compelling. It is a nightmare. For those of you who are wondering, running an on-chain company, it is a nightmare being in thousands of Telegram groups and people expecting hours on Asia Pacific time, for example.
Yeah.
Or in your case, on like East Africa time. It's very inconvenient.
Yep.
Gets old right away. Okay, so you realize now that you can do some magical stuff. And this is like I remember Sonnet 3.6 way more primitive than what we have today. Way less than what we have today. And you're already blown away. You've already created something that can manage all your message inflow. And then you get convicted that you just can't secure it. And so this brings you to this journey. Why do you decide that you want to go and solve this problem? Like,
well, I mean, I think that one, it became clear that this is a serious problem, and it was an interesting one, but it also felt like one that I didn't imagine was going to be solved easily or clearly, like in some kind of silver bullet or slam dunk moment. And I was like, well, I have a high level of interest and a high level of motivation, and I don't know what I don't know, and I'm curious. So that tends to be the right combination of things for me to just plow through something. And so, it just was the right combination. And, when I left Coderina, I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm going to work on this. It was, it was the right time for me to move on based on, I'd done everything that I could, I felt like, in that particular setting. And so there wasn't a lot for me to contribute that felt particularly valuable. And I was ready to do something different. So, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I did feel like whatever I do, I'm definitely going to build things with this technology, and I'm going to have these questions about it. Right. So I'm going to just play around with this and see what I can do. Mm-hmm. But the first thing that I was doing was just making tools that was not necessarily trying to solve the prompt injection piece, but I was thinking about it pretty intently. But I was just like, how do I make really like, so I was making a harness, I guess is really what you call it now. Like I was making a harness in a few different pieces back in, 2024. And then I started thinking about like orchestrators and like how do you take this and build this into tools that you could just say run this and it's going to kick off a bunch of different things, but that's going to be very dynamic, where you could have a couple parameters that you pass it, and then now it's rather than it always doing the exact same process, it's going to fork that and take some particular dynamic. And I was really intrigued by the idea of, like doing, this is something as no risk in prompt injection whatsoever, but I love the idea always of like sparring and taking like some idea and attacking it and trying to make it better. I have a friend who was a former colleague. One of my favorite lines is one of his, that unless the bad of your ideas isn't regularly getting replaced by the good of someone else's, you won't know it and it'll suck. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always like looking for that angle. And I realized like that actually LLMs can provide that really well because they have a lot of general knowledge, and you can point them, especially if you give them really good context for some area of expertise. You give them some, here's this, read these guidelines and these principles. Now attack this angle from this angle, from this side, attack this idea from this angle, and then do that with several. So I was doing that originally with like kind of like fake committee of like, hey, take this idea and break it down and look at it from this angle and look at it from this angle, and then bringing those things together and kind of consolidating those, sort of having like, so I would get to the point of like having almost like IETF spec sort of meetings about various decisions I was trying to make technically or like even just strategically or whatever. And I wanted to have tools to do that. So I started out there with just stuff that I was doing. And then I really, like, every time I started thinking, I was like, I gotta hit the prompt injection thing. So then I from there I started talking to Evil Packet Adam. He is just a fantastic security researcher. Just been doing it for 30 years. He's always finding new vulnerabilities. There's a great, I think his only tweet that he's got is actually from when we were doing those Evil Packet videos. But he found, oh man, I'm gonna have to. Why did I? It just fell out of my head. You're gonna know the name as soon as I say it. Yeah. So his pinned tweet is one that Cox. Yeah. Okay. So his pinned tweet on if you go to his account is from one of these videos that we made, forever ago. That was him hacking Mt. Gox. Like,
really? No way.
Bitcoin. So he had a. What's that?
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
There was a lot of people who hacked Mt. Gox back in the day. It was a notoriously insecure site, but still, of all things to have hacked, that's quite the claim to fame.
But it's fun. It's fun, and it was fun. It's just funny. But yeah, so he's just always poking at different things, and so I kind of went to him and said, hey, attack these ideas. I have these basic primitive concepts of how I might secure this, but I don't. There isn't anything for me to read out there that I feel really good or confident in. So I just started throwing ideas to him and working through it. But yeah, I can go through some of the core concepts, but I think the
well, I want to note a few things. So, first of all, because I'm interested. I'm hearing your story. Obviously, I have a little bit of extra context, having worked with and against you over the last few years. Now I know, of course, it makes sense why you guys were good competitors. I was competing against a committee of superhuman reasoners the whole time. So now I see what's going on there. But it's a little bit interesting. Like the way that you are approaching this problem is very much with an inventor's mindset, right? Where you've got a classic problem. It has to be a worthy challenge. You don't want to pick something interesting. You have to pick something that you call, and I quote, an original sin. And I believe your piece also references another term, the hard, what is it? The hard insight, the brutal insight.
Oh, the bitter lesson. Yeah.
Bitter lesson of AI, the bitter lesson of security. And you're like, oh, well, if I, extrapolate these concepts, I've chosen myself the most brutal security challenge that AI as a technology, as a large language model, specifically as a technology, are likely to face. And you decide you're going to pick that one. You're like, oh yeah, that's the one I want to work on. I'm there for that.
But part of that was actually feeling that I do not consider myself an adversarial security researcher whatsoever. But I do love security, and I love thinking through defenses. And this is definitely something that I have done in a lot of different scenarios. And that is the thing that really, I think, kind of nerd sniped me into it was the realization that this is not like a typical technical vulnerability. It is far more like social engineering than anything else. And because the core of prompt injection is tricking the LLM into doing something. And this is like and at that level, I realized, oh, this is actually something that I have a lot of all the existing pieces.
Let's explain this, because I don't know if that's going to be clear to everybody.
Sure.
Why is this something that you just can't fix? Why isn't there a technical solution to prompt injection?
Yeah. So you mentioned the original sin and the bitter lesson. That is the blog post. So I'll hit those two things. So the bitter lesson of AI is classic notion that essentially there's no cleverness that you can sort of apply to some sort of problem on the machine learning side that eventually a high level of of compute and better algorithm doesn't end up solving. That essentially the basic truth of the bitter lesson is we'll solve that too. Like if you think you've got some great idea now for how to work around some limitation, it's going to be made irrelevant. We're going to solve that, and this isn't even going to be a thing we're going to worry about. So you build a lot of stuff to work around the limitations today of what LLMs are capable of. It's all going to be irrelevant, right? That's the bitter lesson. So we'll solve that one day too. The bitter lesson for me, from a security perspective, is that there is no silver bullet. That security is just it's a grind forever. The bitter lesson of security is it's always bitterly hard. That's it. It just gets harder. There's just, as soon as you make something more secure, now there's a new threshold, because it's always the spy versus spy, attack, defense. They both they just keep ramping up. And so, those don't go away. So the original sin, the concept of the original sin is that when it comes to a lot of powerful technologies, this is the case for smart contracts, the things that make them really powerful, the permissionlessness, the fact that you can have a transaction that just immediately executes based on, just pure logic. Those are the same things that make up the vulnerabilities that, that we know, right? That you can't just get rid of one quality without having, a deficiency on the other side. So those things are just trade-offs that exist. So the original sin of LLMs is similar in that the thing that makes LLMs really powerful is that they're very good at following natural language instructions. They're trained to follow natural language instructions really, really, really well. That means that now every single piece of natural language is potentially a vulnerability. that it doesn't matter like what you and there's no amount of like guardrails or things that you can tell the LLM inside of the LLM that really can't be easily beaten, externally.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly tons of improvement that the model providers have made in training LLMs to better resist prompt injection, but they all have very, very serious limits, especially when you start doing things that look like they could be completely benign and aren't. So this kind of falls into the social engineering piece, where when you're looking at social engineering inside of an organization, for one organization, something might be completely benign, and for another, it might be completely catastrophic. And that's the case for LLMs for sure, where, one application with one LLM, this might be benign, and you go over here and the same thing could be the most, destructive action possible. And then just like in smart contract security, where you're chaining different attacks can turn, two low severity issues. You combine those two together, and suddenly you might actually have a critical severity issue. The same is definitely the case as well, when it comes to social engineering, where you go, hey, this is a pretty benign weak point in the defense, but when I take that and combine it over here, now we've got a serious problem.
Let's contextualize that, because in your article you got a great example using an API key as a kind of a prompt, or as like not a prompt, what's the term, as a prop, as a prop, and then linking that as like, okay, API key is the easy case, now let's look at the hard case to contextualize why these systems are so hard to secure, and we're moving into a world where everybody's going to be using this technology all over the place. So can you walk us?
Yes, great. Yeah, great question. Great point. So yeah, the thing that most people know, there are really good patterns for securing API keys. You can do pattern detection and just completely sanitize, anything that has a key pattern from heading out the door based on that pattern. Well, the problem exists when you have an LLM. Now the LLM could base 64 encode that key. It could use a tool that has allows it to make a call to a URL. The URL could look benign, but it could add that payload just as a query string parameter, and now you've exfiltrated the key. And that gets even more sophisticated as you look at, maybe it writes writes something to a file and then reads it back so that it doesn't have to, so that it doesn't, so it's able to bypass some pattern matching somewhere. Or you even have a case where there's a tool and you restrict the ability for the LLM to call URLs in order to close off this. There's an attack that I just read about recently where that was assumed to be the thing that would lock out this attack, is like, hey, the LLM can't call a URL, but the LLM was able to post the URL to, I think the example was Slack, and Slack then calls the URL because Slack's embedding mechanism calls to get the the OG image for the embedded, to see if there's embedded metadata that it can use to unfurl whatever the embedding is. And so then the agent doesn't even have to call the URL. The agent just posts this into Slack. Slack calls the URL for it, and the exfiltration executes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the fact is that keys are easy mode because keys are a pattern, and there are only specific places that you use keys. You don't use keys just every single place inside of an application. There are specific places that you're going to put them as a parameter, and therefore you can completely isolate them to a set of very, very specific spots, and you can dial in your security there, and then you can look for patterns and all the rest. But that's easy mode, because now it's not just the problem with LLMs is you're not just trying to secure the key, you're trying to secure what the key secures. So all the data that's behind the key, the LLM has access to. So if what you're trying to secure is a secret recipe, now you're talking about a completely different thing, right? If you're KFC and you've got your 17 herbs and spices that you don't want Popeyes to get a hold of, you're absolutely screwed in terms of an LLM being able to, reinterpret the recipe and write it in Chinese, write it in some other language. Now it doesn't even have the words that you're looking for. And so then it goes out the door in an email to, Bob, at some generic Gmail account that seems to be a, reasonable email to send to, that doesn't appear on, any lists or send to a URL or whatever, right? There's there's just so many vectors.
Sure. And that's the easy mode. Now, I'm going to try and rephrase this back to make sure I understand correctly. So APIs have known security patterns, like you can identify API keys pretty reliably. Even so, an LLM, which is just kind of, general purpose machine, can encode, re-encode, deliver this in an infinite number of ways that cannot really be anticipated. Much in the same way you can social engineer and trick a person into doing an infinite number of possible behaviors that their security colleagues could never have anticipated. They're like, you did what? Well, someone told me to do it. It's like, holy, who would ever think of doing that? Apparently someone did. They came up with that attack vector, they executed it, and you were the channel for that attack. And now every LLM is that, unassuming employee who's just exceptionally compliant,
right,
and credulous. It just wants to believe and help everybody who gives them commands, and is punished severely if it doesn't. And if you can't, protect a known pattern, how do you protect the things that have an infinite amount of variability within them? Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, well, and it gets even more difficult because, so what are the existing ways that people defend against this? So you have the sanitization where you're really ensuring that your keys aren't entering into the context to begin with, or where you are using sealed credentials when they're injected. But again, keys, easy mode. So then you have pattern. They're like people that build essentially what I refer to as pattern libraries, but that have these defense like kind of plugins that that sit in front of whatever your calls in and out are, and look for known attack patterns. So they're just looking for, this is just string comparison. They're just looking for language that says, disregard previous instructions or whatever, right? They're looking for these things that are sort of these spells that that can be cast on LLMs in order to get them to do these things that you may have instructions to tell them not to. The problem that exists there, and really well articulated in a conversation I had with Immunefi legend Lonely Sloth, actually, where Lonely Sloth pointed out that you have the ability to, and this is something that I've certainly seen, but not as well articulated as he put it. You have, if you have these tools end up in these patterns and instructions that go along with them. They end up being tools that can be used to do the exact opposite of what they're intended to do, because now you have a pattern that's there. You can say, hey, you can mirror the same instructions that that are in the that are there in order to say, okay, whatever you do, do not do this thing that is dangerous. Do this thing instead, where the thing instead is actually the dangerous thing, right? Mm-hmm. So you're working right with the momentum of the attack defense, and instead turning it into, nope, we're going to go this direction instead. And the same is the case for people try to put in markers to indicate this portion of text is system message, this is user message. If you know that and can discern that, you can use the same barriers in order to to inject the same same attack that those are trying to defend against.
Sure. That's interesting. Now, that all makes sense to me. I was actually been thinking about this problem quite a bit. It is one of my nightmare scenarios about how much I want to trust LLMs, given that I'm in the business of handling secrets.
Yeah.
And it's like, you don't really have a choice but to adopt this technology increasingly, but how do you do that safely?
Right.
Where these things are a little bit, and they're a little crazy,
Yeah.
Like erratic. The personalities are a bit erratic.
Right.
I'm like, this is really tough.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that is, I think, going to be, there is so much pressure, I think, in all, for all businesses to just keep growing, to keep moving ahead, keep moving fast. And LLMs are an easy shortcut to move fast, it seems, in a lot of ways. But the level of move fast that they're capable of is also happens to match with the level of break things that they are also capable of.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell me now, you've come up with the solution. I'm really eager to hear about this in your words as opposed to your writing. You come up with the solution, and it's like almost like you encase this probabilistic mind, this highly accurate, dice roller, so to speak, in a deterministic shell, kind of like the same way that human minds are encased in human bodies. And I want to hear just walk us through your solution with Meld and not Meld with Meld.
Hey, I'll take whatever. But yeah, so the core primitives are that, and it turns out, so Gerard Persoon actually pointed this out to me. There's a security model from the 70s called Bell LaPadula that essentially aligns with pretty much exactly what Meld does. So the idea is that you label your data, and you label the functions that that have certain capabilities that may exfiltration, for example. You might label something as, hey, this has the potential for exfiltration, this particular function. So you label all your data. So you could say, this is a secret, this is proprietary, this is PII, whatever. So you're labeling your data, and you're labeling the functions that are called. And then you have there's some built-in policies, and I'm actually building up more policies that are sort of built in, easy to use, easy to apply. Like, you just say this rule is in effect. So for example, all you could say there's no ability to have exfiltration of secrets. So if if a secret enters the context, then you can't call a tool that allows for exfiltration. So you have to do something else. So part of the interesting challenge is that I'll get there in a second. So in addition to policies, you also have the ability to write guards. So guards are more custom application of, I want to have this specific policy for this, this case. So, sorry, I'm getting notifications. I need to turn my notifications off. What? I have do not disturb on. Oh, it's because hold on. It's because it's my sister. I can't. There's no way to turn off notifications from my sister.
It happens to all of us. I get the same thing coming from my sister.
Let's see. I totally lost my train of thought.
Well, you were talking about guards, so you can do policies on one side, and then data labeling and all there, and how you approach that, and then you can also set up guards to. Yes.
Sorry. No, I'm like. I don't know how to turn off my notifications. That people that I like.
I think you need a guard against your system.
Yeah, exactly. I'm getting prompt ejected here in the middle of this. What the hell? There has to be some system setting to literally turn off all notifications.
You want to get ready for the struggle of the future as you present your ideas to the world. Now you're getting the future that God has in store for you. So notifications everywhere. People attempted to break your policies, challenging your lack of guards. It's all a reflection of your life circumstances.
Okay, show previews never. That should do it. We'll see. Okay. So you have policies and you have guards. I have neither guards nor policies for these notifications that I cannot resist that are under my do not disturb setting. But so guards, so the whole idea of a guard is that you are writing essentially a custom policy for a particular case. So you could say, I want to allow, in general, I have a policy that says no PII is allowed to, to go out the door in this way, right? But in the guard, I could say, well, here's an exception to that rule that I want to allow because I'm adding additional constraints. Or here's something very specific that I want to have as a tighter constraint in this particular case. So the idea is that you're taking more of a hands-on look at your own security model in either adopting a set of policies that are good out of the box or custom guards that you say, and the guards are usually used to punch holes in the policy for specific purposes, because the policy will be overly restrictive and overly cautious to prevent all cases of anything where secret information enters the context window. It will prevent that from going out the door in all cases. So then you have to say, well, which are the cases that you would allow that to go out because you have this specific need in your program. And all of this works underneath the surface. So this isn't just you label this stuff. There's taint tracking underneath the surface of the language that sits there and says, okay, this variable has these labels attached to it. This variable gets used in this function, gets passed to this LLM. Now the result of the LLM is now tainted with the whole history of these variables. So then when you take that data and you're building off of it, you have the full taint history. So when an LLM has had untrusted context entered into its window, and then you can say this LLM's been influenced. So one of the default policies is that if there's untrusted text that enters the context window, then that LLM's output is considered influenced, that there's potential for this to happen. So the simple thing is that in the policies, it's actually incredibly straightforward to block a lot of cases. And then the problem becomes your architectural challenge of constructing the right setup for avoiding overly tainted scenarios where the LLM is unable to do anything, right? Because if you have all this taint that accumulates, you have to do something with that taint
Mhm.
or or you've got to start a completely fresh context. And so a lot of the challenges become different architecture, where you have to think about how do I sequence the way that this data is being used, so that I can have have the ability to make these calls without violating my security policy. So it's the other piece that is, I think, interesting in the design is that I really wanted people to be able to. So Meld is incredibly useful for creating orchestrators. Like, you can make orchestrators really fast in it. Claude, if you use the skills, Claude knows how to write orchestrators in Meld really, really fast.
Mhm.
It's very good at this. I've done a ton of QA and user testing with Claude being the primary user, where I'm just running this over and over and over, and have been for months. But the nice thing is you've got the ability to build what you want in a just very focused on what are you doing, what are you trying to accomplish from a program perspective, and then you can layer in the entire policy and guard stuff as something that you're not inserting into your logic. You're almost putting it in another path that's triggered by the labels that you put on things. So rather than having to embed the security, the security framework in the logic of whatever the orchestrator that you're building is, whatever the functions are, you're layering this on top, and it's something that can kind of be either imported as a module, or could be something that a security team could come in and look at and go, all right, what are the pieces that we need to implement in order to secure this orchestrator in this way. And that's one of the main goals that I had in whatever I built, that I really wanted clean separation of concerns for people who are, whether they're participating in writing prompts, or whether they are building the structure of the orchestrator, or whether they're looking at it from an auditor's perspective, and trying to secure the whatever the attack surface is, that those are able to be looked at independently, where you can really focus on this is where the concern separates from each part. So that's
interesting. If I wanted to go and use this today, how would I go and do that?
So the main thing I would say is so mlld.ai is the website, and you just npm install Meld, and then the main thing I tell people is use the skill, and actually don't write it yourself. Just have Claude write it, or have your agent write it. Use the skill, and then read what the agent creates. Right. Try to describe what it is you're trying to do. Have the agent build something, and then take a look at that, and that's going to be absent the security piece. But then you're going to come back in and layer in security based on whatever it is that you're trying to do.
And how would you describe, how has that changed the way that you work with LLMs today? I mean, I imagine you've just been doing nothing but tinkering with this for the past year.
Yeah.
And seeing it grow and grow and grow. Like, you as an end user, you're still managing some sensitive infrastructure at this point. I believe that.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're up to, but I'm sure you're doing some suspicious things on the mountain. So, walk us through the tangible benefits. I think a lot of our colleagues will be interested. We'll tinker with this, but what is it really useful for? Where are we going to see the life-changing benefits?
Well, I mean, the thing I'm working on right now is what I want the ability to run something like OpenClaw, but do it in a secure way. In order to do that, it requires really a complete rethinking of the architecture. But that's what I'm building up to at this point. But it's not that the primitives don't exist in Meld. It's figuring out the right architectural patterns. So what I've been working on most recently is one piece that I think is relevant here, as well as context, is sometime in the fall. So I've been working on various aspects of Meld for a long time, but sometime in the fall, I found out there were two research papers on prompt injection that came out around the midpoint of last year, one from Google and one from Microsoft, that aligned conceptually with a lot of stuff that's in Meld. And the biggest challenge that becomes really clear when you look at this is it's really where does the complexity fall out as far as how do you handle all of the approvals, or how do you handle the edge cases? How do you handle the fact that you're accumulating this? So Microsoft released this FIDES research paper where they're basically doing taint tracking, similar kind of concept to how what Meld does. And then Google has one, CAML, CAMEL, where the C and the M and the L are capitalized. And there's a lot of similarity conceptually. What they built instead was a custom interpreter for Python that the LLM is actually writing Python in being able to carry out some of these things securely. But there's a lot of interesting overlap. But one thing that becomes very clear when you look at these different models is that the architectural assumptions, the way that people would go about building an agent that would be maybe the most convenient way to think about building an agent, you now have another variable that you have to account for. And I really believe that that variable will become probably the primary area of innovation that's needed over the next couple years, or maybe the next year, because it shifts from, we're all very used to the limitation of context windows, right? That you have, you can only go so far. You're only going to get the maximum intelligence out of the model. In the early portion of the context window is going to rot and all the rest. Well, the same, I think, really applies to the accumulation of taint, that as you're dealing with things that are munging, a lot of different pieces of untrusted data, you now have this taint accumulation that you have to deal with in the same way that you deal with compaction. And the architectural way that that both the way that Google deals with this is, so Simon Wilson deserves a large amount of credit for pioneering a lot of the research related to prompt injection. And he's had a model that he's advocated for a long time that's dual LLM, where you have a quarantined LLM and you have a privileged LLM. And the quarantined LLM is able to touch the untrusted content. The privileged LLM is able to take actions that could be risky, right? So a lot of that means that you have to think differently about your architecture, right? You can't just have this single agent loop that's pulling both of those things together. You have to think very strategically about how do you carry out this particular action in order to gather the information in a way that's going to be secure, without having additional risks of whatever's entering into that the contaminated context window, leaching into the the privileged agent. And so that's the thing. That's all the stuff that I've been thinking about and obsessed about, and doing, so all the development work that I'm doing is really about hitting and exceeding various benchmarks in prior prompt injection research. And most of those really start to fall down on at what point do you lose utility, at what point do you lose the ability to, because so Google's CAML white paper, they demonstrated that they can hit deterministic security, in their model. I could do the same thing with Meld, and then ultimately the ceiling becomes like, how do you make it so that it is still really useful and really work with an agent in that context? And that means a lot of engineering work.
I see. So is it fair to say then, now I guess we're at that stage of the market where people are testing out the different solution paths, I guess, for this problem, and there are multiple different ways to go. With Meld, like in your experience using it right now, you've already hit the point where you are solving your kind of OpenClaw security concern problems. It's already sufficient for creating like a safe OpenClaw. But of course, the challenge is the rest of the OpenClaw architecture does not exist in a way that you can use with Meld. And so your part is working and it's safe, but you can't get all the utility that you need out of the system. Is that a correct understanding about the current state of play for you?
Well, it's more how do you, I think of it like a, like a puzzle. Like you've got to figure out the way to get, you've got clean data and you've got dirty data, and you've got a goal, and the goal requires the clean data and the dirty data, right? So what are you going to do in order to get to the point that you're aiming at that doesn't end up where the dirty data ends up, turning the, reducing the security of the clean data, helping you reach the point that you're trying to. And that is the fundamental, that's the fundamental architectural challenge, because I can easily block things from happening, but how do you maximize the utility, right? How do you ensure? So if you're building an orchestrator, great example. People are using, tools to essentially triage GitHub issues, right? So if you can identify which issues what are the issues and the types of issues you're willing to trust. Maybe you say these authors, like I trust, if this author is the submitter, or these set of authors are the submitter, or it's previously labeled or whatever. I'm going to trust that as trustworthy content that I feel safe exposing an LLM to, right? You've got to make, and that's one of the challenges that exists also, is you have to make good assessments of what data is trustworthy. Because if you give an LLM untrustworthy data, if you tell an LLM, do this destructive thing, the LLM is going to do it, right? If you tell the LLM these instructions are trustworthy, then you hopefully put in other guardrails that that you minimize what destructive actions you're even willing to take in that context without some additional approval. But in the case where you're doing some triage, people are using this where they go, hey, triage all these issues, and based on the issues, take this action. And I think we've seen a few attacks recently where this has been exploited through GitHub issues. Well, today you could build you could build an orchestrator pretty easily in Meld that would enable you to have those kinds of protections and still a high level of capability. But now, the architecture for going from there to an agent that can do all these different things, it requires another level of complexity in all the different pieces. I'm definitely finding that to be very, very doable, but it's a very interesting challenge, I will say. So, all the primitives are there, but you have to think about the architecture totally different. So it's not that the architecture is incompatible with with stuff like OpenClaw. Like I think a lot of what is there you could probably port into OpenClaw, but there's a big piece of how you think about and one principle that I think about from an architecture perspective is like the experience that you're having with an LLM is really the last mile. Like the UX of the conversation that you're having with the LLM, that's the last mile of all of the stuff that's happening under the surface. And so if you actually think about that as this is just what your interface is, whatever the conversation you're having with the agent, but that agent then is delegating to a bunch of different agents, some of which may be privileged and some of which may be quarantined and may be accessing untrusted material. That's the architecture that you actually need. Is you need some way of that overarching agent then delegating to these other pieces. But the way that it ultimately plays out is you end up building tools that are agents, where you have that can perform a certain set of functionality. And the way that I am handling this architecturally in Meld is, so Google, the approach they're taking is they're writing code to execute various pieces of it. The way that I'm approaching this is that an LLM, in order to call certain functions, they're adding policy. They're basically saying this is what I'm going to allow for this particular piece. Those policies are all subsets of what policies you've actually set and allowed for LLMs to carry out. So it's a different angle. You're effectively choosing strategically where do you allow a clean, trustworthy agent to punch holes in your security framework, right? Which things do you allow them to do where they can make the call? And this is, again, clean, trustworthy agent that is adhering to your security policy. Okay? So in those cases, which things are calls do you allow them to make, and then to set policy for a sub agent within that narrowed scope. That's that then becomes the main path.
Did you ever talk to Jens, who was the CISO over at Avalanche?
No, I don't think so.
He's a really interesting guy. He was.
I mean, I know. I don't think it's possible I've talked to him in a conference, but I don't recall. But yeah,
he's very discreet, unassuming, deliberately so. He had an interesting background. Done lots of stuff in his life. Like you, kind of built a very varied mindset, and he's got an interesting kind of investment approach to security because he brings I think a lot of the best CISOs tend to have these much more general mindsets. They've done lots of other things in their lives beyond security, and so they're not limited by the security or the engineering mentality. They're constantly looking at things from other perspectives, and there are lots of different models for security in this world. Now, I raised that because this problem that you're describing is exactly the problem I have with OpenClaw. Amazing system, looks beautiful. I so want, I talk to my friends about our AI stacks, and I'm like, I want memory persistence in my stack. I can do absolute magic with this. I, have hired hundreds of people in my life, and I can manage things at vast scale. And I know what I can do with this, but I can't do it because it's like I build a team, but everybody's completely unreliable. And the moment I give it stuff that's important, like payment data or sensitive PII, all the useful things, right? Or access to my email or my files, everything it needs to be a huge point of leverage in my life, then it becomes a very material security concern, and I don't have good ways to gate it. It's the obvious thing was can I have an agent that is sitting on top of it and basically, monitoring the outputs of every other agent? And you've already noted why that can both work, but not really work.
Right.
And then you get to the conclusion, it's okay, I need a deterministic system that can control these probabilistic outputs. It's well, I had no idea how to do that. And it sounds like you've made one, but then you realize you don't just need a deterministic system or kind of a body or constraint on all of these separate minds. You need a deterministic architecture that encompasses all of the differences and, both monitors and then enforces all of these things pretty precisely so that the LLMs can't make a mistake. And ideally, they're kind of ignorant of it, or they have, as little awareness in their context as possible. And I rose up the Jens point because he had this great security insight that took me a while to grok my head around, but of course you end up believing it's right. He said, if you have to teach people how to do anything, as a security leader, you've already lost. I was like, what do you mean? Okay, well, it's the only way to truly win at security when you're dealing with unreliable actors, which all employees are, including oneself. The only way to deal with them as probabilistic systems is to put in place architectures that preclude the kinds of problematic actions.
I agree so completely. I mean, and that's really a core part of what I am thinking about with. So one, the idea, the architecture that exists within Meld, you will have the ability as an organization to set policy and to set guards that then.
Oh, you back, Sock?
It says waiting for the host to join. Oh, okay, now we're back.
Got so excited.
Well, the thing I was going to say is that it's built for the IT policy world, where you have people who are focused on, this is what we are going to allow people to do that is safe, that we can be sure is safe. And so the idea of having an overarching organizational policy, knowing your data and your own, I really believe very strongly that like the most important thing that almost anybody working in software can do is to work on understanding threat models, and whatever the threat model of the thing that you're trying to do is, and how to defend that. And if you've got IT department that's looking at the threat model of your own unique organization, and you can say, these are the things we cannot ever allow, you can build that into policy in Meld. And so then it really is, the architecture piece is there on the fundamental level, and the piece to build up the capability side is really patterns. It's like, how do you figure out the right way to guide a series of steps that ensure the capability that you want, because everything that you said about wanting to use OpenClaw, it's exactly how I feel. I'm like, I run a lot of businesses, and I know exactly how I could break out this task and this task and this task in these ways, but I can't do it until I can feel confident and trust that. But it is exactly what you say. But it isn't that the architecture needs to be there to ensure the security. It's actually that the architecture needs to be there to enable the capability, because the security is there. I already have it's actually easier at this point within Meld to ensure that a dangerous capability is blocked than to enable a super powerful capability, because those patterns are still being built. I mean, and that's essentially what I'm focused on right now. Is like, okay, well, how am I doing this? And I'm pretty thrilled, frankly, about the progress that I've made in the last week as I started working just directly against some of these benchmarks, because the benchmarks for a lot of the agent security stuff, they are aware of this trade-off, right? It isn't just, can this block the dangerous thing, but can the agent still accomplish something that's really powerful in the context of doing that? And so working through these benchmarks has been awesome from that perspective, because it says, okay, what is the architectural pattern that needs to be applied here in order to achieve this goal? And how can that be generalized so that people who are building these things, they can just look at and go, oh, okay, well, that's how you solve that, right? Sure. So there's not, the major barriers are just figuring out, like, what does it mean to even build this architecture this way for the first time, because there's no patterns for doing it cleanly.
Yeah, I have no idea. I'm glad you're working on this. How can we all follow along with this adventure that you're on? It sounds very relevant. I think a variety of us building technologies and applications increasingly in this new world are going to need what you're building here. How can we follow along and participate in this journey?
So I started something earlier this year that I'm intending to open up and invite people to participate in, that is essentially an open research lab, an open security research lab called Disregard, G-U-A-R-D, guard, like a guard dog.
Your names are impossible to search on first. Disregard.com. Oh, there's your ship. Nobody's going to find this spontaneously when you spell it like that.
Yeah. So the entire name is, a pun on the disregard previous instructions, right? So, but the good thing is that almost all of the names that people are going to read things on the internet, right? They don't have to hear it on a podcast and know how to spell it. They just read disregard and they see the pun in the name. So, Disregard is really, it's a combination of a research lab and a way of demonstrating patterns for prompt injection defense, right? So this isn't intended to just, promote what I'm building with Meld. It's intended to do a lot of research in the direction of, how do you solve these problems? And even, one of the things that I'm intending to do is, I consider Meld to be, very kind of bleeding edge experiment in a lot of this stuff. There's a ton of defense in depth that Meld has. It's not just the labels. There's built-in sandboxes and virtual file system, and there's a bunch of extra stuff that it just helps you to do from a defense and depth perspective. But it's also got some patterns that I think are useful for people in any context. So there's a library that I extracted out of what Meld does called SIG, where you have one of the biggest challenges that you have prompt injection is the agent can't tell what is a trustworthy instruction versus what's not, because there's no believable texture. So essentially signing the instructions and then giving those to agents, giving agents the tools to be able to tell what is the signed instruction versus what's the entrusted data, and being able to see that from a trust boundary perspective. And I forked OpenClaw and actually added this. There's a vulnerability that was reported that took advantage of this, and I was able to essentially defeat that vulnerability just simply with this element of having the LLM required to check the trustworthiness of any instruction that it receives, that these are actually coming from a signed source before it follows any instruction, and you essentially gate its ability to perform certain behaviors off of that. That's extracted as a concept from Meld. This is actually a secondary defense, and it's another pattern, I think, for clearing taint, in a way where you'd say, here's the whole history of how this got tainted, and then I have this pattern that in another post there, auditor and the airlock, where you sort of have you sort of break that piece out and take a look at it and say, can we proceed with this action or not? But you're completely separating out the action from the tainted state. But there's
keep building these patterns. You're going to share them all with us in the internet.
Yeah. So the goal is really to build up. I think there's a ton of security researchers that want to get in on this stuff. They want to attack it. They want to defend it. They want to think about it. And so Disregard is intended to be, a community where people can, participate in building up these things and, and helping to publish research on it and advance their own learning and advance, I think, the overall space. So, excited about just opening that up and creating opportunities for people within there, because I believe, there's a lot of need for security researchers who do know this stuff. And I think people who are, are blockchain security researchers are really well primed in a lot of ways because of the uniqueness of what types of thinking that you're doing when you're attacking smart contracts, and how that is kind of interestingly has some parallels to prompt injection attacks.
I agree completely. And on that note, let's wrap up. We're going to add links to Disregard. I found the website. I did. We're going to add links to Disregard as well as Meld and your article. There's a lot of links we're going to have to gather in the aftermath of this conversation to the show notes here after it is posted live. Do you want to add any final comments before we wrap up, Sock? I mean, this has been great. We went over time. I don't mind. It was great for me. I learned some new stuff. But anything you want to add before we jump?
No, I mean, the main thing I would say is that, I love the community that Immunefi has built. It's definitely a community of people that I care a lot about. They're all folks that, for the most part, were part of Code Arena's community and are part of Code Arena's community. We're part when I was part of it. So the biggest thing I would say is, thanks for continuing to serve that community well. And I want to give greetings to all the researchers out there whose work I just love and respect. So,
well, I think it'll be more fun if we sick them on you and your new Disregard AI and see what happens there. I think there's a lot of troublemaking still to do. I think in a lot of ways we've cracked protocol security in the on-chain world. We've figured out the defensive patterns there, but we haven't really cracked AI security. So there's some fun to be had. in this area, and maybe you'll find yourself at the center of it once again. I think it could definitely be. But with that, thank you everybody for joining. A reminder, if you want to get involved with us at Immunefi, go to immunefi.com. We're happy to support either on the security side, if you're a security researcher, hunt. And of course, we want to bring as many interesting people and things to you going into the future. So happy to welcome Sock to this episode of the show. I'm going to go and check out Meld myself. Maybe Disregard too, but I don't know if I'm good enough to get in. That's a separate challenge. I encourage you guys to go and have some fun with that. This is one of the great new frontiers, and we're all lucky to be here together on it. Thank you again, Sock, for joining us, and I'll see you all later, everybody.
Thanks, Mitchell. Great to talk to you.